Hello guys, today this video is about the part B of the same question earlier. You can find the process of applying the concepts for part A in the previous video. So today we are talking about the second part of our essay question, which is 15 mark. So before we go to the concepts and how we can think of the points, just to give some tips about 15 mark essay question. So like your 8 and 10 mark questions in CSQ, your 15 mark essay questions will also require you to do evaluation. So what does evaluation mean? For your non-evaluation questions, which are things like elaborate, explain, state, these things are very straightforward because you apply the concepts like that. But for evaluation, actually it is a very broad word, and if you hear some of your teachers in GP may say very frequently, unpack the term. So this is also the same for econs because there are many ways that you can evaluate. So for myself, for my teaching experience, the best way to evaluate is to be very clear what you are evaluating on. And at the start, if you can help your examiner to scope and understand how are you going to evaluate a certain policy or a certain problem, then it will be very clear for the examiner to follow your essay as well as for yourself when you think of the points. So let's spend some time to talk about how we can do the unpacking, because every question is different. You will need to have some parameters that you can play with across the different evaluation question. So for the first most important thing is that how do you tell this is an evaluation question? So usually we see the action word, the verb, which usually is at the start of the question, but sometimes it could be in the middle of the question. So just identify what is the verb that the question wants you to do. So in this case, discuss. So okay, discuss is quite clear. This is an evaluation question because you have to be able to form a viewpoint. So not just talk about how a policy works, but also to discuss. So in this case, discuss is to talk about how do you think the policies can address the problem of residential price inflation, because part A talks about the inflation and how it happens, which is your answer, and part B is how do you reduce it. So when we see the preamble, we know that the problem is inflation of your housing, and then the solution is to reduce the inflation by lowering your price. So this can be done through different ways with government intervention. So this question is contextualized to Singapore context because they talk about your Singapore government. So of course, Singapore government means the policies is implemented in Singapore. And if you have some background knowledge or you follow the news quite closely, this is a good thing. But if you don't, it is also okay. You can also do the question because the concepts that you have learned is also applicable and able to be contextualized to the housing market. So let's see how we can do that. But in the first place, before we even start to think of what are the policies that we want to talk about, in this case 15 marks, so if time permit, I'll talk about 3 policy. If not enough time, talk about 2. So they say discuss the policies that might be used. So when you look at the question, what can you talk about the policy? Firstly, most important is how the policy works. This is the basic. This is the just talking about application of content, the mechanism through which the policy can reduce price. So this is your concept. It is not evaluation because you are just talking about how it works. There's no view. You are merely applying a fact. This is not your view about good or not, suitable or not. So here when the question wants you to discuss, you can discuss through a few ways. So are you going to discuss about effectiveness? Because when you look at a policy, is usually for the purpose of solving a problem. So effectiveness is a logical way to discuss about a policy. Because it is not other things like, oh, discuss the name of the policy and stuff. You want to talk about how well the policy addresses the problem. And sometimes you can even talk about, are there other impact? Because when you do a policy, sometimes you will have other impact, which later on you will see when we go through the possible options of the policy. So here, to make your analysis rich, I would suggest for this context, you can talk about how well the policy addresses the problem of inflation and whether there are other impacts. So if you pick a policy that is effective and then the impact to other areas is low, actually this is the policy that you should choose. Whereas if the policy doesn't do well in these two areas or none at all, then it likely means that it's not a suitable policy. But when you want to talk about effectiveness, you have to talk a little further. What do you mean when the policy is effective or not? So you talk about whether it addresses the root cause, because there are reasons that leads to the inflation that we saw earlier. So will the policy remove the trigger of the question? So does it affect the root cause, and is the effectiveness long or short term? Effective policy will have a long-term impact. So if you do a policy that only works when you do it, and when you stop, say, investing money or implementing it, the problem comes back, then you are not really addressing the problem. So the policy, the ideal state will be when you implement it, the problem is solved at the root cause and it will not happen again. This is called effectiveness. So if you are able to tell the examiner that, okay, for this question, I will pick 3 policies to talk about how the Singapore government can reduce inflation for residential property, and I will evaluate among these 3 parameters. So firstly, is the policy effective in addressing the root cause? Second, is the policy effective in addressing the root cause and at the same time making sure that the effect is long term? And then looking at whether the policy brings about other impact, then you can see how well each of these policy does, and you can determine, oh, then this will be the most effective policy that doesn't have other impact. So when you do that, when you start to talk about beyond how the policy work, then you can be very clear how you are going to discuss. Otherwise, students, they will come to a situation, a problem where they talk about, okay, how policy 1, 2, 3 works to reduce price. Then they will be thinking, then how do I talk about which one is good? Then they will start to list the limitations of each policy. But when you look at the pros and cons of each policy, how do you know which one has the highest pros, which one has the highest cons? Then this 3 parameter will actually help you to determine, is the pro bigger than the con? Is the con very big or cannot be addressed? Then you can comprehensively discuss and compare across the policy. So do have these parameters in place to guide how you are going to evaluate. Because if the question you don't evaluate clearly or well, you will be marked down significantly. Sometimes even when your concepts are fine, you will be marked down, say, by 5 to 6 marks of a 15-mark essay, because for a 15-mark essay, the weightage of evaluation can be about 5 to 6 marks. So that's quite significant. Okay, so with that, let's think of what we can say. So the 3 policy you should think of will reduce the price of the residential market. So the first one that you can think of is the price ceiling. So this is again your concept, because I not necessarily must be very caught up with Singapore's residential property news, then I can talk about price ceiling, because the question is, what are the policies that the government might implement? So if it's a might question, so long it makes sense, the examiner will accept it. So price ceiling. So okay, to recap on price ceiling, we know that the price ceiling is an artificial price level that is below equilibrium that is implemented to reduce the price. So in this case, the free market we saw in part A, it was unable to allocate a reasonable price for the market, is too high. So in this case, the government need to reduce it. So this is a price below equilibrium price. Okay. So by process, this can reduce price, because when you talk about policy, try to draw the graph to help the examiner visualize your thought process. So here was the issue of the price. Okay, we call it P0, that is too high from our part A. Then the price ceiling is implemented below this, which is now we annotate as PC, that prices cannot go beyond PC. But we know that for your price control, including your price floor policy, there are problems that comes along with implementing it. So here, for your price ceiling, we see that there is this issue of shortage, where your quantity demanded is higher than quantity supplied. So there's a shortage. And for the housing market, if there is a shortage, then you will have instances of people not having access to housing. Some of them, the gap between your QD and QS are the people who don't get the access to housing. In a way, it reduces equity, because the price is the same. So how would the government be able to tell who they want to allocate the house to if, say, you only have 5 units of houses, which is at, say, $10, extreme example. But if you have 10 people who can pay $10, how do you tell who you can allocate the housing to? So although the prices have been lowered, but you created another problem. So you created the problem of inequity. So actually this policy is not so good, right? Because if you implement one policy to address a problem, but it brings about other problem, then you cannot say that this policy is good. So in this case, it is a negative effect, but to price is a positive one. So you can use this as a point of evaluation for you to decide, among the 3 policy that I'm going to talk about, is this so good? Okay, then we look at when this inequity is created, any other effect to the economy. So we learned that, okay, when there is a shortage, there is this area which is the deadweight loss, this red shaded area. This is our deadweight loss. Because for this quantity of people, they would have been better off at P0, because at P0, your welfare, your consumer plus producer welfare is maximized. But here you have an area of welfare that is reduced. So this is the deadweight loss, resulting in deadweight loss. So you have an overall fall in welfare for the society. So this is a little similar to your market failure if you think about it, because market failure, you also have underconsumption, overconsumption, and then they talk about how this leads to a deadweight loss. So this is the same. So you have some points to talk about. Okay, and in terms of the long term or short term, so in this case, we can say that, okay, the root cause has been addressed, because the root cause is that the price is high due to very high demand. So when you implement the price ceiling, you are curbing demand in a sense, because there is a shortage. So you address the root cause. But the impact, is it a long or a short term? I would think this is a short term impact, because the fact that this creates another problem would signal to the government that this is not a long term policy, because it cannot be that I still continue to implement a policy that is going to bring unhappiness among the people. Because when people see that there's a shortage of housing, they will likely raise to the government about their displeasure, because housing is a necessity good. Then if you have a shortage of it, people are going to get impacted. So when the government hear feedback from the ground, they will usually rethink about this policy or even withdraw it. So in terms of the effectiveness, it is a short term and it creates other impact. So I would say for price ceiling, they have done well for 1 out of 3 of the parameter. So not really well, because it's a fail. But the comparison is meaningful only if you compare with other policy that you are going to talk about. So think of some other policy that can actually have a better performance in these 3 parameters. So at least a 2 out of 3 or a 3 out of 3. Okay, so that is the first policy that we will talk about, a price ceiling. The second policy that we can talk about is your subsidy. Okay. So in this case, because our end goal is to reduce price, right? So our subsidy, we can think of how we want to reduce price. So for subsidy, you can think of the government giving subsidy to the suppliers of housing. Because we know that the price inflation is caused by a high demand in part A. So if you give the supplier subsidy, it will reduce their cost of production, and this will actually increase supply. So when you look at the graph, if your supply now shift right by a lot, it can actually reduce price. So you are working on the market forces to freely allocate the price to be lower. So now it's not really a artificial reducing of price like a price ceiling, but you allow the market to react in a way when your policy is being thrown in to reduce price. And in a way, this is a more sustainable measure, because you are allowing the free market to work on their own. You don't have to keep intervening. You only need to keep intervening by giving the subsidy. So here when we draw the graph, it will be, okay, so we follow the graph that we drew in part A, which is that your demand and supply curve are quite steep due to your PED, PES being less than 1. So our very high price was at P0 now. Now we let this be the new equilibrium. So when you provide subsidy to the housing supplier, you can shift your supply a lot to the right and then bringing down prices. So now when you talk about the price falling, please do include the price adjustment process as well. So you talk about, okay, at P0, actually there's a shortage. No, there is a surplus, sorry. So you have a surplus because your QS is more than your QD in this case. Then there is a downward pressure on price. And we learned that when that happens, your quantity supplied will decrease, your quantity demanded will increase, and you meet at the P1 where the prices are now lower. So here in this case, you are also tackling the root cause of the issue, because one of the root cause of the inflation being very high is that your demand increased very fast, but your supply cannot catch up. So now what I'm doing is that I increase the supply. I make sure that my supply catch up. Supply catches up to demand. Because in that case, it will be a healthy adjustment where my demand increase but supply also increase to meet the demand, then I will bring down prices. So in terms of the longevity of the policy is likely to be tackling the root cause. So this is good. The root cause part here, it is a tick. In terms of the long versus short term, it will depend on how you implement the subsidy, because we know that for subsidy, it is a costly policy, because when the government gives subsidy to the producer of housing, it will be creating opportunity cost for the government, because it will be huge amounts of money by the government, and the government could be able to have used this subsidy amount to build other areas like healthcare, education, for example. So this is costly, but if this subsidy is not a full subsidy, because subsidies you can determine how much you want to subsidize. So if say the supplier takes $1 million to build a housing project, then the government can subsidize 1 million, which is the full subsidy, or to subsidize half of it. So if the subsidy is partial, you are likely to implement it for a longer period of time, because then now it is less taxing for the government. So I would think in this case, you can conclude that the implementation is maybe a medium term, which is not bad. It's better than a short term measure, which is okay. Then we see that the implementation of the subsidy mostly is a cost to the government, not really a cost to the house buyers or the supplier, which in fact the supplier benefit from the subsidy. It's just that when the government implement the subsidy, they must make sure that the suppliers are still able to build quality houses lah. Because for suppliers, sometimes when they know that I don't need so much cost to produce something, they may compromise on the quality of house. But the fact that in Singapore market, the housing safety measures are quite strict, with a lot of regulation to ensure that there is safety guarantee, right? This is likely not a very important problem. So here the subsidy actually does quite well in terms of the 3 parameters. So 3 out of 3. Tackling the root cause, a relatively medium term solution, and then the impact to creating new impact or problem is don't have. So you see, if you are faced with time constraint, you can actually just write these 2, because I have quite comprehensively compared them. So in addition to talking about how they reduce price, I also compare their pros and cons, and I weigh them against the parameter to compare. So I would think if no time, write these 2 is enough. If you want to think about a third policy, it is also possible. So we can think of what are they? Any other policy that actually reduces your price? So here, when we are looking at reducing price, we see the artificial lowering, we see the increase in supply. Maybe the third one, we can also consider how your demand can fall for housing, because demand increasing a lot is one of the trigger for the price inflation. So we can think of something to decrease the demand, and when your demand shift left, it will bring down your prices. So perhaps we can have some inspiration for the preamble. So now, because I have a winner among these 2 policies, which is subsidy being the winner, I will remove my price ceiling to make space for the third possible policy. Because sometimes we also need to know how much we need to write, because in exam, if you can talk about the 2 policy with time left, say just nice, you talk about 2 policy, then the paper ends, right? It's very good already, because you have substantial evaluation that can help you score marks. Maybe in this case, you can even get a 12 or a 13 if you say very well, which is actually good enough for A. But for thinking process sake, our critical thinking, we can think of something else. So the something else that we can explore is to increase our interest rate. So recall that in the preamble, decreasing interest rate is one of the reason why demand for housing increase, because now it is cheaper to borrow. We talk about how interest rate is the cost of borrowing. So when your interest rate actually is higher, it will be more costly to borrow. So when it is more costly to borrow from the bank to buy house, people will borrow less, and when they borrow less, they will demand less of the housing. So if you want to represent on the graph, you can show that the demand decrease. So again, talk about the price adjustment process. Whenever you have a change in price of the market, you have to show the price adjustment process. So I show that actually my demand decrease from D0 to D1, and you see that my price decrease to P1, and my quantity also decreased to Q1. So this still achieve the objective of reducing the price. And then now we look at across the three parameter, is this a long-term measure? Okay, so firstly, does it tackle the root cause? I would say yes, because it decreases demand. So a tick here. Then is this a long or a short-term measure? Because for the bank, they also have to earn interest to sustain. So I would say if the interest rate now is too high that discourages borrowing, it will have impact on the bank. And banks are very important sources of money supply for the market. Okay, now we are going a little macro, but we need to acknowledge the importance of the role of the bank for the government, which I know that we didn't really learn in micro. So this requires a little bit of background knowledge of the financial market in macro, which I think J2 student would be more appropriate to do this. So if J1 students don't have, maybe you won't even think of the interest rate as a policy. So I would say among the three policy, you can deprioritize the interest rate one, simply because could be a lack of context or the explanation is not so robust as the two. However, we can say that, okay, the increasing interest rate may be a rather short-term policy, because we know that when the bank has less borrowing, because when less people borrow from the bank earn less interest rate, and this will affect the prosperity of the bank. If the bank become poor and eventually close down, it is very consequential. So this policy is likely a short-term one. So short term. And then is there other impact? The impact will be to the bank, who will suffer from the lower borrowing. So in this case, I would say for the interest rate one is also not so well performing. It's a 1 out of 3. So among these three policy, the subsidy one is the evidently more higher performing one. Then you can see that the conclusion is, among the three policies that the government might use to reduce inflation, the subsidy one is the most appropriate in your opinion, because it is effective in addressing the root cause of the inflation, which is to increase supply. It can be implemented in a relatively medium to long term time period if the government can manage the resources properly, and then it has minimal impact created in other areas. So it will be very clear, how do you evaluate, how do you discuss? Yep. So okay, this one I would say this question is a little tricky, because students will be quite put off by the fact that it is a Singapore context. They will feel like, oh, I must use the Singapore context. But you can see how you can still use the general policy that you learn and apply it. Because this question has some flexibility in terms of what are the possible ones. So long you can logically say how it can be implemented to reduce the price, then it is okay. Okay, so for this, please note the importance of unpacking how are you going to discuss by anchoring your answer on a few parameters. Here I put three, the root cause, short or long term, and the impact to be comprehensive, but try to have two parameter. One is tricky because if you just have one to say, oh, across the three policy, does it tackle the root cause? Then you only have an option to say this is a yes or no. It could be in the end, 2 out of 3 policies still tackle the root cause. Then you again are unable to differentiate which is better. So at least have 2. So make sure that the policy that you are advocating for fulfills these 2. Then the other 2 will either not meet any of the 2 parameter or only meet 1. Then it will be very clear the performance of the policy. Okay, so this skill, you can apply it in all your evaluation question, be it essay or your 8 and 10 mark CSQ. These are very important aspects that you need to think about to train your critical thinking. So you see, it's not just about saying how the policy works. This is still not evaluating. So think of how you can evaluate, and when you do more, you will come across more types of evaluation, and you will have a structure that you will follow when you do, and you will less likely be anxious or panic. Okay, so yep, this is the end of this video, also about 30 minutes. So I will see you at the next video. Bye bye.